Greetings and welcome to Mysterious Library, where we've had a few little technical hitches tonight. I'm in the North Woods of Wisconsin, and we have a storm blasting through here. I think my internet went down briefly. We're also waiting on our surprise guest tonight, who is Edd Schultz. Edd Schultz used to be known as the psychic priest. He was the exorcist for Ed and Lorraine Warren, and we thought tonight, what could be more interesting than talking about the differences between the type of exorcisms that we see on the screen and that we read in some of our favorite books, and the experiences of a real exorcist, in this case, the one and only Edd Schultz. So assuming Ed can come through, because I think he's had some technical issues on his side as well, that's what we'll be talking about tonight on Mysterious Library. Well, greetings, everybody. We do have Edd Schultz here with us in studio, although it looks like your microphone might be muted, Ed, if you can hear me.
Uh-oh.
There you go.
We okay?
We are good. Now, just to so the audience know what's going on, my usual co-librarian here in the Mysterious Library, Jason McLean, had to be called away because of a family medical emergency. So prayers out to Jason and his family. I'll let him talk about it if he wants to, hopefully next week when he returns. But tonight we have joining me at the last minute. We were planning on having him on in a couple of weeks, but he jumped in to help out, and that's the one and only Edd Schultz. For those of you who haven't watched Talking Weird over the years, Ed has been a guest there a number of times. Ed used to be known as the psychic priest. He was an exorcist for Ed and Lorraine Warren, and he has quite an extensive background in all things paranormal and psychic and remote viewing and the like. But tonight, I think we're primarily going to be focusing on Ed's background as an exorcist. And you were ordained originally in the Episcopal Church. Is that correct, Ed?
That's right. I apologize for this jumpy picture. I'm trying to get myself situated here.
That's all good. That's all good. As long as we can see you, that's the main thing. Yeah, we had a technical problem just before with getting your aspect ratio right, but we won't worry too much about that. I think the main thing is that we can all hear you. Okay, so maybe you can let the audience know a little bit about your background as far as how you got into the clergy and what went from there to becoming somebody who was a practicing exorcist as well as a priest.
Okay. Well, I've always, ever since I was a kid, had an interest in parapsychology and the paranormal, probably because I grew up in the 1950s and there were a lot of horror movies out there and all that sort of stuff. And I was also a magician as a kid and later on into adulthood. And one of the things that kind of fascinated me when I was back in about 1960, when I was about 12 years old, there was a comic book line called Classics Illustrated. And they had one particular volume that was called The Story of Ghosts. And I was fascinated by that. And there was an article in the back too about J.B. Rhine and the experiments he was doing with parapsychology at Duke University. So, this is kind of the early background as a magician, and I also developed an interest in hypnosis while I was doing magic. So, as a kid, I mean, the first time I hypnotized somebody was when I was 12 years old, and I had all of these different interests, and then I kind of put a lot of those on hold. But then I went into college, and I felt I had a vocation to the ministry in the Episcopal Church, which is what I grew up in, and went to seminary at Boston University School of Theology, and graduated from there in the early 1970s, was ordained. And shortly after I was ordained, and this is really a key part of the whole story, a parishioner of mine told me about Silva mind control, Silva, because I had done mind reading. Mentalism was my favorite kind of magic. I had done mentalism, for potluck suppers and things like that as entertainment. And this fella came up to me one Sunday morning and said, "Hey, Ed, how would you like to do that for real?" And I, of course, that piqued my interest. So I said, "Tell me more." And he told me about the Silva Mind Control course, and he invited me to attend a free lecture. I attended the lecture, and they were talking basically about different levels of consciousness, entering a sort of alpha state, an alpha brainwave frequency state. And while there, being able to project your intelligence to any point or place in the universe and become aware of actions taking place, as they said. So that really stimulated my interest in the psychic and in parapsychology. My instructor was a fellow by the name of Chris Jensen, and we get along pretty well. And the course, and I won't go into detail now about the course, but when I finished the course, I thought, well, maybe I might like to become an instructor too. So Chris and I talked about that a little bit. He was in charge of instructors for the New England area at the time, and it just didn't happen to work out. I was living in Massachusetts at the time, and I moved. I went to another parish, and Chris and I kind of, lost touch. Shortly after I arrived in Ridgefield, Connecticut, there was an article about me in the local newspaper, and I got a phone call one day. "Hi, Ed, this is Chris Jensen." And I said, "Oh, hi, Chris, how are you?" And he said, "I'm fine. Welcome to my hometown." He lived in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Is that coincidence or synchronicity or providence or what?
Maybe.
I don't know. And he and I began to talk about our common experiences with parapsychology and hypnosis and the church. And we started talking about the possibility of writing a book together called The Church and the Psychic. Now, back up a couple of years, while I was in Massachusetts, shortly after I was ordained, I did a lecture series of I think it was about an 8-part lecture series called The Church and the Occult. One of the things we talked about, of course, were ghosts and hauntings and all that sort of stuff. ESP in the Bible, excuse me, near-death experiences. And I decided to do something like that in Ridgefield, sponsored by the local clergy association, excuse me. And they said, okay. And Chris came to those lectures, and I had a tremendous response to that. And Chris said, Ed, maybe we should extend this because there's so much interest. So we started to do monthly, what we called church and psychic seminars. And we would touch on all kinds of areas of the paranormal. We had a lot of different guest speakers, excuse me. And at one point, this was in Connecticut, and Ed and Lorraine Warren were in Connecticut, and Chris had heard about them. He knew about them, and they were lecturing locally. And he said, "Hey, Ed, you want to go and listen to Ed and Lorraine and see what they have to offer?" I said, "Sure." So we went to their lecture. I was fascinated by what they had to say. I didn't necessarily buy into everything that they were saying, but I was still fascinated by it and by them. We talked to them afterwards and said, "Okay, we need to talk about this further." Well, in the meantime, because of the success of our seminars, Chris and I decided to start a foundation, an educational foundation called the Foundation for Christian Psychic Research. And this was during the occult explosion in the 70s, and The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby and Damien, The Omen and all that sort of good
Hmm.
stuff. And so we went to see, we established this foundation, and of course we needed a board of directors and an advisory board. So we talked to Ed and Lorraine for a while, and they were very nice, very cordial. They invited us to their home. They showed us Annabelle and all these other things in their paranormal museum. And then I said to them, "Would you like to be on our advisory board?" And they said, "Sure, we would be happy to do that." And lo and behold, a couple of weeks, we got a call from Ed, and he said, "Father Ed, you're a priest. I need an exorcist. Have you done an exorcism?" And I said, "No, actually, I have never done an exorcism, but let's talk about it." He said, "Well, we have this young woman from New Jersey whom I believe to be possessed by some kind of demonic spirit, and she and her family are willing to come up here to Connecticut to go to your church if necessary and have an exorcism." He said, "If I could come to your office, I have a tape recording of my meeting with her and an attempted exorcism in New Jersey. I'd like you to hear it, and then you can decide whether you'd like to do this or not." So while I was waiting for Ed to come, I did as much reading as I could about exorcism. Now, in the Episcopal Church, at least in America, there are no official exorcists. In the Roman Catholic Church, there are official exorcists who are appointed by the diocesan bishop and who generally go to Rome, the Vatican, for training. And then the bishop has these exorcists to call on when he needs them. But we don't have anything like that in the Episcopal Church. There was a study done in the early 1970s by the Bishop of Exeter in England, Church of England, Anglican, and they did a study on exorcism and they published a report. And in the report, there was a liturgy for exorcism, which we don't have in the Episcopal Church, didn't at that time, and still don't have one. So I got a copy of that, and okay, here's the first exorcism scenario. The Warrens said, "We will bring this young woman and her family, her parents, to your church, and we'll have you perform an exorcism." And I said, "Okay, I'm ready." I had my materials now. Now, I had not been trained by anybody because there was nobody in the Episcopal Church to train me. So I did everything I could. Let me back up. I need to slow down here a moment. When Ed came to my office and played the recording, I had very mixed feelings about the whole thing. Now, first of all, I was not all that familiar with the Warrens at that point. All I knew was what I had heard from them at their lecture. And Ed explained to me, well, no, when he played the tape, this was a tape recording that he made at the young woman's home. We'll call her Patty, at Patty's home, where an exorcism was attempted. Now, first, Ed was the one who performed the exorcism. Red flag, red flag. That's a big no-no. In the Roman Catholic Church, it has to be done by a priest. The priest has to do a very deep, detailed preliminary examination, preferably a psychiatrist, a doctor, to make sure there's no mental illness involved. There should be a detailed family history to see if there are family issues and that sort of thing. None of that was done. It was just Ed said, "You're possessed." And Ed was a self-proclaimed, self-educated demonologist. Where he got that title, I'm not really sure. But anyway, uh, so he played the tape for me. Now, here are some things that raised red flags for me in the tape. First of all, as I said, it was Ed who was doing the exorcism. Lay people in the Roman Catholic Church and pretty much anywhere else are not supposed to do exorcisms, only clergy. Second red flag was, now he's making this recording in the presence of the young girl and her family. And he's saying, it was kind of like a narration. Imagine that he was doing a documentary, but the narration was live right on the scene instead of a voiceover kind of thing. And Ed says, now the first thing we're going to do is a test of religious resistance. Because if this young woman is truly possessed by a demon, she will not be able to tolerate sacred things like holy water. I have some holy water here and I'm going to sprinkle it on her. So Ed sprinkles the holy water on her, yelling, screaming, groaning, growling, all that sort of stuff. The next test of religious resistance that I'm going to use, I have a crucifix here, and I'm going to put it on the back of her neck. And if she's genuinely possessed, again, this is being said in the presence of the young girl, who was about 19 or 20. If she's genuinely possessed, the demon will not be able to tolerate it. I'm now putting the crucifix on the back of her. Bang! Wham! Pow! Furniture is flying, going all over the place. People, he had a couple of bodyguards there. They jump into action and they hold the girl down, and there's yelling and screaming. And Ed is, the power of Christ commands you. And he's yelling and screaming all these things. And, I mean, I was as exhausted then as I am now, probably more, just from listening to all this stuff. And I'm thinking, whoa. Now, first of all, this goes back to my experience as a hypnotist. I know that the subconscious mind is very powerful. And I know that the power of suggestion is very powerful, especially when you're dealing with young people and people who are very impressionable. So, in my opinion, he should not have been narrating this in the presence of the young girl and her family. He was, and this is sort of like in stage hypnosis. What you're doing is a form of hypnosis in which you're telling people to do all kinds of strange, weird, and unusual things, bark like a chicken, cluck like a dog, that sort of thing. Take your clothes off because it's very hot. And people do these things because they think they're hypnotized and they just subconsciously go along with it. Well, this young lady was certainly going along with Ed's suggestions. And
fascinating.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure what to think of all of this at that point, but I said, okay, Ed, and I have to admit, now I was young. I was in my early 20s and had only been a priest for a few years. Hey, this was kind of exciting. And I thought, yeah, I want to do this. And I had seen the movie The Exorcist. So I said to Ed, okay, bring her on. So they brought her, but I had a different approach to exorcism than they did, and then from what I had seen in the movie The Exorcist. My feeling was, and I think this was for the most part based on what I felt were the New Testament examples of exorcism, particularly the kind that Jesus did. I don't remember Jesus yelling and screaming at demons, telling them to leave in his name and that sort of stuff. Basically, he said, get out of here. And they went. And that was it. So my theology was, if there are real demons here, I should be able to do a low-key thing. I'm not in any kind of big fight with a demonic bully. I'm a priest of the church. I have authority to do this. And I have God and all of God's power behind me. So why do I have to yell and scream at this this demon. I should be able to do just what Jesus did and say, okay, get out of here. Now, I tried some of these tests of religious resistance myself. First, before Patty came to Connecticut, I spoke to her family on the phone and I said, I'm going to send you a release form. It's just a release that says if anything happens, if Patty or anybody gets hurt as a result of this exorcism, I'm not to blame, my church is not to blame, that sort of thing. And they said, okay, send it, we'll sign it. Now, before I sent it, I took some holy water and I put it on the paper right in the place where she would be signing her name. Didn't say anything about this to anybody. Sent the release to them, and I had said, please bring this with you when you come to the church. So they came to the church. They were out in the parking lot, and as they were approaching my office, I took a set of rosary beads that I had received from a nun, and I wrapped them up in a handkerchief. Just held them myself. When they came, I said, after the introductions, I said, do you have the form? The release form that I gave you. They said, yes, here it is. They handed it to me. And I said, no problem with this at all? No problem at all. Okay. She failed the religious resistance test number 1 that I gave her. If she was really demonically possessed, she should have detected the holy water and wouldn't have been able to write it. Religious resistance test number 2, generally people who are really demonically possessed cannot enter a church. They came to the church. We went into the church. No problem. Number 3, the handkerchief. I gave Patty the handkerchief to hold during the exorcism. I didn't tell her what was in it. I just said, here, I'd like you to hold this. No problem holding it. No yelling, screaming, growling, gnashing of teeth or anything like that. We went into the church. Ed and Lorraine were both there. Patty's family was there. 2 burly, husky guys were there, just in case. And my rector, I was the assistant to the rector in this church. He was there too, to participate in the exorcism. We had Patty kneel at the altar rail. I very quietly said the appropriate prayers, laid my hands on her head. And at one point in the exorcism ritual, the priest is supposed to command the demons to identify themselves. And I said to her, basically, if there are any demons present in this woman, I command you, in the name of Jesus Christ, to identify yourself by name. Crickets. No response whatsoever. Okay, that says to me, I'm not sure there's any demonic possession here at all. She's failed all the tests of religious resistance that I gave her, and the demons aren't identifying themselves. Okay, so we have something else here. So I said to myself, okay, we are going to do what I might call a metaphorical exorcism. I'm going to use the ritual just as it's written. I'm going to imagine, first of all, if she is genuinely demonically possessed, I'm prepared for that. Again, I'm a priest. I have the ritual. I have God behind me. No problem here. And if she is not actually possessed, but there is something else that's going on here, the service of exorcism is really a service of healing. And that's part of what I use as well, some of the healing prayers that we use in the Episcopal Church. I said to myself, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a rite of spiritual healing with her. I went through the whole exorcism, no yelling, no screaming, very quiet. When I finally finished and did a final blessing with Patty, she raised her head, she looked up at me, there were tears streaming down her face, and she had a big smile. And I said, Patty, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And she said, I feel wonderful. I feel free now. So she went home with her family. Ed and Lorraine went home, but I think they were disappointed disappointed that there wasn't any yelling and screaming, and there was no big battle between me and the demons. But again, that was their approach. Well, everything seemed to be fine until maybe a couple of weeks later or so. I got a call from Patty's family, and they said, Patty is still seeing things out of the corner of her eye, these dark shapes and forms, and she thinks it's kind of like there are people who are trying to talk to her, and that was one of the supposed symptoms that Ed and Lorraine were talking about. So I said, okay, I tell you what, I'm willing to take a ride to New Jersey, to your home. We'll do some more prayers. I'll do a blessing of the house, and I'll bring with me Chris Jensen, my partner. He and I were both trained psychics, not mediums, trained psychics through the Silver Method. And I said we'll have Holy Communion. I'll do a blessing with Pat, and we'll bless the house. So the two of us went. Before we did any kind of blessing, Chris and I said, okay, we're just going to, using our Silver Method technique, kind of psych out the house and see what we feel. Well, my impressions were that Patty wasn't possessed by a demon, but rather perhaps, and again, when you're dealing with the paranormal, when you're dealing with all of these things, who knows? There's very little way that you can really verify something. So my impression was that Patty was perhaps a natural medium, and she was somehow picking up on departed spirits, earthbound spirits. And that's what this was really about, and not demonic possession. And I also got the feeling something about a sea captain who may have been in that area, maybe who had murdered his wife or something like that. And Chris didn't pick up anything, if I remember correctly. So I said to Patty, this is what I think it is. I think that you're a natural medium. These spirits who are earthbound are coming to you asking for help. I said, from now on, whenever you experience this kind of thing, if you think you're experiencing some person who's asking you for help, you say to them these words: into God's hands, I commend your spirit. And I said, that's it. If they come and bother you again, you say the same thing until they go away. Well, we blessed the house. We had Holy Communion. I left. Everything was fine. I got a call a couple of weeks later from Patty's family saying, everything is fine, back to normal. Patty's doing what you were saying. And oh, by the way, we did a little historic research. And there was a sea captain in this area who was accused, who was believed to have murdered his wife.
Oh, wow.
So, and as far as I know today, Patty is doing just fine.
Huh.
So that was my first experience of exorcism, and it was my first real experience with the Warrens. And it did, as I said, because of what I experienced, it raised a lot of questions for me. I was still willing to work with the Warrens, but kind of under my terms. That I felt that I would always use a multimodal approach whenever I did this kind of thing. I realize, there may well be unclean spirits, demonic spirits, whatever, floating around who do this sort of thing. I don't know for sure. By faith, I might say, yes, I believe in them. But again, how do you verify something like that? It's impossible. You can, in my point of view. Good. Everything okay there, Dean? The devil is calling. Okay. From my point of view, I'm doing things on a number of different levels. and felt secure in what I was doing. And as I said, because of my background as a hypnotist, I was not about to tell anybody what was going to happen. My approach would just be, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what we think may be going on. This is what we're going to do. And that's it. Don't worry about it. And the several times that I did do exorcisms for and with the Warrens, this is the same kind of thing that happened. After a little while, the Warrens stopped calling me. And I think there were two reasons behind that. One, as I said, I don't think I was dramatic enough for them. And two, a local newspaper interviewed me. Well, a number of them did, but one of them in particular, that was kind of in the area that Ed and Lorraine lived. They asked me all kinds of questions about working with the Warrens and that sort of stuff. And I did sort of tell the reporter that I was a bit skeptical about some things that the Warrens did. They probably read that, and they may have been offended or something like that. I don't know. They just stopped calling me.
Huh.
And ironically, now this is just a little side note. I have a son who is now 50, and back when he was in his early 20s, and this was a number of years after I lost contact with the Warrens, my son was studying to be a funeral director. And he was at the New England Institute for Funeral Service or something like that. And Lorraine Warren, this was after Ed was deceased, Lorraine Warren, for some reason or another, went to the school to make a presentation. And when she found out that Chris was in the audience and that he was my son, oh, wow, Father Ed's son.
Huh.
And my son kind of backed off a little bit. And she said she detected all sorts of spirits in the school. But I did not have opportunity to talk with Lorraine after all of that. So that's a long answer to your question.
Well, I suppose it launches us into so many other questions as well. I think the most obvious one, because of what we're talking about, might be that some of the exorcist techniques that we're used to seeing in movies and reading about in books could actually potentially be damaging to the
That's
people.
right.
If somebody goes into it having not done the type of procedures that you do to try to determine whether this person is genuinely possessed or not, but goes in guns blazing, and if the person is already somebody who is susceptible to suggestion, one can only imagine sometimes that might make things worse.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the same kind of thing too that sometimes happens with survivors of alleged satanic ritual abuse and that sort of thing. Sometimes their memories come up as a result of hypnosis, someone trying to regress them back and trying to get these hidden memories out. And if you're not careful as a hypnotist, you can be feeding them, just like Ed was feeding them all kinds of suggestions. What are you hearing now? What would I can't think of something like that. It would be a leading question, but it's sort of like, when did you stop beating your wife?
Right.
These kinds of questions that elicit an expected response. And when you think of somebody, again, like Ed Warren, he had a reputation for being a world famous demonologist. If he comes into your life and says you're possessed by a demon, you're probably going to believe it. And if you've heard his lectures with these stories about all these things, and you've seen the movies, now in a couple of minutes, I'd like to tell you about my experience of seeing the movie The Exorcist. But if you've seen all that and you've been fed all of this sort of propaganda from the media, does this sound familiar? You're going to have certain expectations about what's going to happen to you. And you don't want to, subconsciously, You don't want to let these people down. You don't want to let the exorcist down. You don't want to let the demonologist down. So if the exorcist is yelling and screaming at the demon in you, that demon is going to yell and scream back at him. But if the exorcist is just calm, cool, and collected, all right, if you're there, go. Well, I think that's a lot healthier way to approach it.
I think that
And
we have something. I just
go ahead.
quickly, I think we have something, and we won't talk too much about this because we could do a whole show on this, but I think we have something similar that's gone on around much of the supposed therapeutic culture around alien abduction experiences.
Mhm.
I suspect that there's a very similar process at work where there's an expectation by the therapist, and the person in a hypnotic state already perhaps knows what to say and what is expected of them from consuming large amounts of science fiction popular culture, or perhaps
Right.
having read the book of one of these alien abduction
Mhm.
regressionists, because a lot of these people write books and then they know exactly
Right.
what to say. But I think we should stay on the Exorcist track
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
that's what we were talking about. I'd love to hear your take on
Sure.
some of these movies.
Yeah. Well, before I saw the movie The Exorcist, and I saw it when it first came out, the only thing I knew about exorcism was, again, what I had read when I was studying the New Testament. And this was, I mean, The Exorcist came out, what was it, 1972 or 73, something like that. And think I think I was already ordained at that point. A friend of mine from a college buddy, who was also a fan of horror movies, called me up and said, "Ed, there's this great movie out called The Exorcist, and I want you to go with me to see it in Boston." So I said, "Okay." We jumped in his car, we went to Boston, and the first thing that we saw as we were driving up to the theater is people coming out of the theater holding their heads, holding their stomachs, crying. And I thought, whoa, what are we in for here? And we went into the theater, and I think it was kind of like playing on two screens or something like that. We went into the theater, and there were these men laying down on the floor in the lobby. Some of them had passed out.
Good
Uh,
grief.
I went into the men's room, and while I was in there, this guy comes charging in and vomits, into the toilets.
Oh
And
my
I'm thinking,
goodness.
oh, do I really want to see this movie? So we went in and we saw the movie, and it was very eye opening for me. I mean, it was a great horror movie. It's probably the best horror movie, the scariest horror movie that has ever been made. And I did find out later that they did a lot of kind of innovative subliminal gimmicks and effects that people weren't aware of in order to help scare the bejeebers out of you. Well, when I saw the movie, of course, I immediately went home and I went out and bought the book so I could read that over. And that's where I got sort of the beginning of my education about what exorcism is really all about and how it's done. They did mention, I don't know if they mentioned it in the movie itself, but in the book, they talk about a classic text that's called Possession and Obsession by Spirits Good and Evil by someone named Osterreich. It's a classic about it. Well, I was able to get a copy of that. Um, so I read all about exorcism and possession and that sort of thing, and all of these symptoms that you need to look for. I mean, for example, one of the classic symptoms is that they seem to have supernormal strength. Okay, well, people who go into hysteria and things like that, they sometimes have supernormal strength. Um, Also, people sometimes will speak in foreign languages that they're not necessarily familiar with. Now, the interesting thing about this is if that's a sign of demonic possession, there's the story in the New Testament in the Acts of the Apostles about Pentecost. And on the day of Pentecost, the apostles are all gathered together, and the Holy Spirit is like tongues of fire over them, and they start talking in different languages, languages that are understood by people from different countries that are around there. Well, that's the same as one of these symptoms of demonic possession. Uh-oh, what's this all about? I wonder. And of course, Patty and none of the other people that I dealt with the Warrens spoke in any foreign languages. So that's another symptom that wasn't necessarily there. That is, according to the texts, that's one of the definite symptoms that you're supposed to look for to decide whether a person is actually possessed by a demonic spirit.
Did you encounter anybody who had that supernatural strength, though, or that above normal psychotic, perhaps, strength?
No. No, I have to say that. I have to say I never experienced a Hollywood style exorcism. I did not do a lot of exorcisms, but all of the ones that I did were pretty much like I described with Patty, except there was one exorcism. There were a group of Episcopal nuns in Brewster, New York, that I was familiar with when I lived in Connecticut, and they somehow they had a visiting priest who was from India, an Anglican priest from India, and his wife. Somebody felt was possessed by demons, and they were coming sort of for a retreat because there was a retreat house that the sisters had, and they called me up because they knew that I was into all this kind of stuff, and they said, "Father, would you come and help with the exorcism? Her husband is going to do an exorcism." And I said, "Okay." And of course, I don't speak Hindi or whatever language it is that they speak, so I couldn't do that. But I could tell by, again, the approach that her husband was taking. His was one of the rough and tumble, yell and scream at the devil things. His wife passed out during the time that we were there, and she was mumbling and grumbling and all that sort of stuff. That was the closest I came to a Hollywood style one. But again, it seemed to me that he was leading this kind of behavior by his suggestion or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that he was doing that purposefully. And I'm sure that the exorcists that are trained by the Vatican, that everybody has their own theological beliefs about what's going on. And I know there's a recent movie, fairly recent, I think, called The Rite, R-I-T-E, starring Anthony Hopkins as an exorcist. And I just saw a clip of that earlier today, and it was a clip of Anthony Hopkins saying, "The only way you're going to defeat him is if you believe in him." So, kind of sobering stuff.
I know a popular theory, and one that I probably am sympathetic to when it comes to demonic possession or when it comes to genuine demons, is that these things are the spirits of the Nephilim, like when the Nephilim died, because they weren't really human, they weren't really angel, they were somewhere in between. Angel's a misnomer anyway, but let's use it because it's the popular term. But they weren't Elohim, they weren't human, they were in between. So their spirits afterwards kind of would roam the planet and then attach themselves to people sometimes. Are you familiar with that theory? Was that something taught in the church at all when you were there, or is that
No. The only place I've heard that is from you in some of your previous shows. So that was new, a new idea to me. I'll certainly research it and I'll look into it because it's an interesting theory.
I think it's become more popular recently through the works of the late Michael Heiser, who we lost recently. I mean, other theologians have certainly talked about it as well, but Heiser went and I suppose, deconstructed much of the supernaturalism of the Bible, which has been overlooked by many denominations, and said, well, this is, what this actually was. This is what that actually was. Here's the belief that Jews in the intertestamental period actually had, and this is where it comes across in the New Testament, and where it comes across in some of these type of the Christ type demonic exorcisms you were talking about before. But anyway, I think you'd find
Right.
value in the unseen realm. I think you'd enjoy that book.
Yeah, I will check into that. I will say that but go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, have you encountered things that you thought that probably was demonic, or that probably was supernatural, and that wasn't just somebody who might have been having a psychotic episode, or a psychic episode, or weren't just under the powers of somebody's suggestion?
I would have to say no. I think that most of the people on which I performed an exorcism, I think, in a sense, partially in terms of what we've been talking about, created their own demons, or had their demons created for them by someone else. There's another exorcism. The kind of thing I'm talking about is, I did another exorcism on a woman who, I don't remember. I think she came from Detroit with her husband. And when I got to the point in the exorcism where I said, if there are any spirits in this woman, identify yourself. And she started saying things like, spirit of laziness. And I said, okay, spirit of laziness, I cast you out. Are there any other present? Spirit of irresponsibility. And she went on like this and identified maybe 6 or 7, and they were all these kinds of behaviors that I concluded she didn't want to consciously take responsibility for. Maybe something was going wrong in the relationship or something like that, and she was becoming lazy and irresponsible, all of these sorts of things, but didn't really want to accept personal responsibility for it. So she created these demons, somehow. And I don't know whether this was related to the Warrens or not, because I really don't remember. We're talking close to 50 years ago. I don't remember how they were referred to me. But it sounded to me as though she was almost doing her own psychoanalysis as we were going through this. And as I cast these things out, I think there was a real healing that came about as a result of this metaphorical exorcism. And she and her husband seemed to be fine after that. They called me a couple of months later and said things were doing great. So I would have to say that my experience has been primarily with people who were either convinced by themselves or by someone else that they had been possessed by some kind of demonic or unclean spirits, but were not, in fact. Unless you say, well, if they created an unclean spirit or a demon, then that's what it is. I don't know.
Did any
and
of
there
these?
may have. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, did any of these cases have perhaps a type of psychic externalization or exteriorization, where you thought there might have been something akin to poltergeist activity happening, but perhaps generated by the allegedly possessed person themselves?
I have investigated some poltergeist phenomena, but it wasn't necessarily in relation to a person who was possessed.
Can you
It
tell
was
me
in
a little
other
bit? Can you tell me a
circumstances.
little bit? Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about that? That sounds interesting.
Sure. Well, there's one experience that I mentioned in the book that I'm working on right now, Confessions of a Psychic Priest. There was a young couple who moved into a new home, and the wife was a school teacher. She was fascinated by the occult, and I think she had been doing some Ouija board work and stuff like that. And she had a friend who was a medium, who believed herself to be a medium. And during her summer vacation, she was, for the most part, alone in her home, and she would hear noises around the house that didn't seem to make sense. And then they had two dogs. I think they were German shepherds or something like that. And when the family would go out, they had a little boy, by the way, 9 or 10. When they would go out, they would leash the dogs to two separate posts that were in different parts of their basement. When they would come home, whoops, when they would come home, they would find the dogs leashed to the same post.
Weird.
And they if this happened once, that, well, maybe I forgot and accidentally did this, but it happened a number of times. And then during the summer vacation, when this woman, Judy was her name, when she was home working, one day her husband came home from work and he said, "Are you all right? I tried to call you a number of times today and the phone was always busy." And she said, "Yeah, I'm perfectly fine." Well, they took a look at one of the extension phones and it was off the hook. They asked their son about it. They said, "Did you do this?" "No, I didn't. I didn't do that." And again, just like with the dogs, this happened time after time after time. Whenever Judy was alone in the house, somehow or another, the phone would go off the hook, and they couldn't explain that. And their son, now, it's possible. There are theories that whenever there's a young child in the house, it may be a case of RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, where it's the child who's trying to work something out, and children are kind of natural psychics, and maybe they have these abilities that they're not aware of. That that may have been the case. I don't know, but we did. Again, I did a house blessing. We went around to every room in the house and did these prayers of blessing and exorcism, and things seemed to be okay after that. Um,
Huh.
there's another element. There's another element to this that I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, um, one of the strangest parts about that is when I was there, I went down. They said they heard noises in the basement, voices like children or a baby or something like that. I went down there and kind of psyched it out. And my impression was not a sea captain this time, but a husband and wife. And the husband was a very malevolent person, and the wife somehow was very upset about her child. That was all I got. Well, I don't think the Warrens came into this one, but there was another woman, the friend of this woman who believed that she was psychic, a medium, came into the house and didn't hear anything about what I said. And she went into trance, and said she felt the presence of a woman who was crying, very upset because her baby, and then she went to a very specific location in the living room, and she started stamping her foot and saying, this woman is coming through me, and the husband, her voice changed and she started talking as though she was the wife, and she said, I don't want to do this. He's making me step on my baby. He's making me step on my baby. And she kept slamming her foot into the floor,
Good grief.
as though she was stamping on the baby. And this woman who was a medium did what she felt was necessary to kind of clear things up. Um, and after the house blessing, no more dogs going back and forth in the basement. No more phones going off the receiver coming off the cradle, and no more babies crying. So there you go. Who knows?
It's just one of your many weird experiences. Nancy Malcolm asks a question. I'm not sure if I entirely understand it, but maybe it's a terminology I don't quite understand. Maybe it's something asked in exorcism. She asked, "Did you ever ask the demon who its angel was?"
No, I'm not familiar with that.
No, I'm not sure either. Um, what about other just before we go, because I'd like to ask you a couple other
Mhm.
questions. We might go a little over the hour.
Sure.
It always seems whenever I talk to you, I've got hundreds of questions and I can't hit them all. What about I know you have
Where am I
this book you're working on, which I'm fortunate enough to have read a couple of advanced chapters, and I have some more which I finally will have the chance to read. Just fascinating.
going?
I can't wait until your book Confessions of a Psychic Priest comes out, because this is just some, I mean, your exorcism, your history as an exorcist is just part of the many realms of the weird and the paranormal that you've been
Mhm.
involved in your life. But what about other supernatural experiences that you yourself might have had, like outside of actually going to do an exorcism or something? Have you felt something which you've been fairly convinced is not of this human realm? Like, have you had supernatural encounters or paranormal encounters? I know you
Well,
talked about the things in the basement, but I mean just personally outside of your own
right.
work, like when you're out in the field when you were doing something, have you in your personal life had encounters with things?
Okay. Well, I did. Yes. Again, a lot of this happened back in the early '70s, and I think this was around the time that I was giving my lecture series on the church and the occult. My wife and I had my son was newly born, so he was maybe a year old, if that old, and we were living in a two-family house, an old two-family house in Massachusetts. And one night, in the middle of the night, he started crying. Well, I woke up and I felt this tremendous pressure on my chest, like I couldn't get up and I couldn't speak. And as I opened my eyes, I saw my wife running out of the bedroom, and the thought flashed through my mind. I don't know whether she's running to the baby or she's running because she's afraid of me. Because as I started to try to talk, it was all coming out sort of exorcist type or not possessed type, kind of a. I couldn't form
Goodness.
words, and it was a very deep kind of uh, sound. Finally, I calmed myself down, and I could get up and go and see what was going on. Now, I did find it wasn't until years later that I learned about what's called sleep paralysis. We won't go into that in too much detail. But as part of this story, my wife told me afterwards that she hadn't told me before, but there was a long stairway that went up to our apartment. Most of our apartment was the second story kind of thing. And she said, number one, she always felt cold in that stairway, even in the middle of the summer. And there was one time that she didn't want to tell me about. She was going down the stairs and she felt hands on the back of her shoulders pushing her down the stairs. And she
Goodness.
cradled the baby in her arms, and they were both okay. Well, we had the night that this sleep paralysis thing happened, and I apologize for bopping all around here. I'm holding my tablet with my hand and trying to make sure I stay centered there. That's a little better. Um, so I, I did call a priest and he said prayers and things like that. And the next day I did from the Book of Common Prayer or one of our liturgy books, I did a sort of exorcism of the stairway. Well, it wasn't long after that my wife and I got a new job and we moved to another city. But before we did, I spoke to the landlady and she said, by the way, did anything peculiar ever happen up there? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, we didn't want to tell you when you were first renting from us, but this house used to be an old barn. And as the story goes, there was a man who hung himself from the rafters. And the rafter that he hung himself from was kind of in the vicinity of the stairway that goes up to your apartment.
Gosh.
Was that the guy who hung himself, or just sleep paralysis, or what? I don't know. And that was too early in my career for me to really have, any kind of definitive answer about.
Are we going to read about that in Confessions of a Psychic Priest? Is that going to be in
Yes, yes, it is. So that's really the major psychic experience. I mean, other than I've had plenty of experiences with telepathy and remote viewing and things like that. But if we're talking about kind of ghostly type things, I would say that was my major experience. Spooky. Are you with me, Dean? You're frozen. On my screen, at least, I don't know if you can hear me, but on my tablet here, your picture is frozen, and I'm not sure whether you can hear me or not. So I'll just hang out here until I get some kind of indication from you as to what's happening. I suppose I could blabber on about some
I'm here.
other. Oh, you're gone.
No, can you see me? Am I here, Ed?
I'm there, but you're gone.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear. Yeah, there we go.
We got this.
You're back.
We got this crazy storm blow through here. You should have heard it. I think it took my internet down.
Oh,
briefly. Well, thanks for holding down. Thanks for holding down the fort while I was gone. Maybe that's a message.
Sure.
We were almost dead on an hour. Maybe we should sign out of here. Well,
okay.
Well, the going's good because
Sure.
there's a big storm here. Just fascinating to talk to you. You were saying, I don't know if you got to say it when I was gone. The last question I asked you was about when we can expect Confessions of a Psychic Priest to be finished. So were you able to answer that? Or was
I would say right now
I'm
I'm between 75 and 80% finished. This is what, April. I would think at least by the end of May I should be able to submit it.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have you back to chat about it then, and when it's published, of course, Jason and I will dissect it as we do here on Mysterious Library. But it was such
Give my best to Jason, by the way.
I will keep him and his family in your prayers if you could. The same for everybody else out there. And it was just a great joy to talk to you, Ed. Thank you for coming in at such late notice as well tonight when we heard Jason was unable to do it.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure to be with you, Dean.
Always just wonderful to talk to you as well, Ed. And to everybody else out there, thank you so much for watching or listening or however you're consuming the Mysterious Library. And as Jason always says, and next week, we'll catch you again at the card catalogs. Keep it weird, everybody.